Hello, everyone, and welcome to the October presentation of the Friends of History First Wednesday Lecture Series. These monthly lectures are being provided free of charge by the Friends of History with the support from the New Mexico History Museum. We do, however, accept and encourage donations. These funds will directly go to support the lecture series and, more importantly, all History Museum programs and exhibits. Should you wish to donate, just go to our website, shown here, and click on the donate button at the top of the page. Our speaker today is Dr. María Nogar, Professor of Hispanic Southwest Studies in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of New Mexico. She will be speaking on Ms. Nina Otero-Warren. A leading female nuevo-mexicano in the state's political history in its early years, Ms. Otero-Warren is best remembered as the noted advocate for women's suffrage and a major force behind New Mexico's ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. In recognition of this important event, she appears on the recently released fourth quarter in the history-making four-year coin series being issued by the U.S. Mint, which celebrates women's accomplishments. Dr. Nogar's talk today was an essential part of last month's symposium and Community Day celebrations sponsored by the New Mexico History Museum. The Friends of History wish to thank Dr. Alicia Romero, head curator of the museum, who introduced us to Dr. Nogar for this first Wednesday lecture. We are happy to have this talk as part of the History Museum's celebrations for Ms. Otero-Warren's achievements, embodied in the just-released U.S. Quarter. And now, here is Dr. María Nogar.
Hello, my name is Dr. María Nogar, and I am a professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of New Mexico. And I'm delighted to share with you today a little bit of information about Adelina Nina Otero-Warren, a very important figure in the history of suffrage, politics, literature, and many other fields here in New Mexico. And of course, who is important at this very moment in time because her quarter has has recently been reproduced on a U.S. Mint quarter as part of their series of American women that they've recently released. I'd like to thank the Friends of History for inviting me to give this talk, especially Ben Woodbury, who's been very helpful. And I'd also like to thank the head curator of the New Mexico History Museum, Dr. Alicia Romero, for inviting me to participate. Without ni más ni menos, vamos. So, Nina Otero-Warren's biography, and she's a fascinating, multifaceted individual, which this talk will try to give you a little bit of an idea about who she was. It's usually prefaced by her family's long and eminent political history in New Mexico. As a descendant of the Luna and Otero families from the Rio Abajo, Otero-Warren was born to Eloisa Luna, whose family traced its history in New Mexico to the Oñate expedition, and to Manuel B. Otero, whose father, Manuel Antonio Otero, had purchased half of the Baca land grant in Estancia. His brother Miguel had the other half. Together, Eloisa and Manuel B. had three children, Eduardo, Nina, and Manuel. However, Manuel was born a month after his father's death at the hands of an American land grant squatter and millionaire, James Whitney, who shot Manuel B. in the neck as he asked Whitney to leave lands that were Otero's by use and under legal dispute. While a wounded Whitney was spirited away by his family members and then was redirected to trial in Valencia County and then let out on bail by a judge who let Whitney leave to California, Eloisa, then 19 years old and pregnant, welcomed her husband's corpse. Whitney was later acquitted for Manuel B. Otero's death. Though certainly the topic of its own presentation, there are several folk songs treating the events leading up to Manuel B. Otero's death, including an Endita detailing the events of the confrontation, documented by Donald Chavez and Gilbert and Enrique Lamadrid, as well as songs sung by Casimiro Luján of Torreón, and another by Plácida Romero of Peralta, which was documented by Otero-Warren's friend, Erna Ferguson. that tell the tragic and unjust events of Otero-Warren's childhood. And these are really important because the corridos recorded for the Spanish-speaking community of New Mexico, of which, of course, Nino Otero-Warren was a part, a history with which many of them felt a great deal of identification and sympathy in the late 19th century and early 20th century when many nuevomexicanos were dispossessed of their lands. And so this is an important part of understanding how she was later viewed by friends, by colleagues, by other nuevomexicanos, as she became the first Latina in the US to run for Congress, as she worked for suffrage in the state, and as she later held various political and civic positions within New Mexico, including being the first female superintendent of schools in Santa Fe. Eloisa, Nina's mother, gave birth to her son Manuel a month after his father's death and later remarried, having 9 children with her husband, Alfred Berger. One of Otero-Warren's half-sisters, Estela Berger, married the conservationist Aldo Leopold, author of the Sand County Almanac, and there's a trail here in Albuquerque that bears his name just a way up on the Bosque. Otero-Warren's family moved from Los Lunas to Santa Fe, and Otero-Warren, who had long been supported by her family's nanny, Maria Elizabeth Doyle Orteta, attended school, first at St. Vincent's Academy in Albuquerque, and then Maryville College in St. Louis, returning home in her teenage years. And this was very common for Nuevo Mexicano families to send their children east for education to Catholic schools. Felipe M. Chacón, who wrote a poem about Nino Otero-Warren, had many family members who attended such Eastern schools to achieve their law degrees. After many years of informal political involvement with her family in Santa Fe, as her cousin Miguel A. Otero served as territorial governor, Nino Otero met U.S. Cavalry officer Rawson D. Warren at a party in Albuquerque in 1907, and in 1908, they were married in Santa Fe, soon moving to Fort Wingate. Otero-Warren soon discovered that her husband had a partner and 2 children living in the Philippines, and this, combined with her general dissatisfaction with Army wife life, ended her marriage. She returned to her home in Santa Fe and was generally referred to as the widow Nino Otero-Warren. She began to engage in civic and political activities in Santa Fe, including suffrage organizations and including chairing the Child Welfare Department in Santa Fe. When in 1907, property rights were seized from women in New Mexico by new American laws imposed on the territory, Nina ensured that she and her sisters were financially taken care of by trusts established from her mother, Eloisa's estate. With the shift in jurisprudence from Spanish and Mexican law to American law, women were no longer assumed to receive their portion of a family estate. Instead, of course, in following with American tradition, it went to men. So Nina was very aware of this and made sure that her mother's will had special exemptions, special trusts built in for the women of her family. By the time Otero-Warren was in her mid-30s, she had become a significant figure in a variety of public offices in New Mexico and had taken on leadership roles, including superintendent of public schools for Santa Fe County. She was therefore targeted by national organizations, including the National American Women's Suffrage Association and the Congressional Union, to organize and advocate for women's right to vote. Many other states had, by 1915, granted women state-level right to vote, but New Mexico had not done so, and movement nationally to amend the Constitution, guaranteeing women the federal right to vote, was in full swing. Otero-Warren was already involved with the National Association of Women's Clubs, which had lobbied unsuccessfully for women's right to vote using less overtly political approaches. Otero-Warren soon became a primary point of articulation between national suffrage organizations, in particular the Congressional Union, and the ground game in New Mexico for organizing and lobbying elected officials to weigh in positively on women's right to vote. Otero-Warren's efforts in this regard are a field of ongoing study, as they had not been seriously considered since Charlotte Whaley's biography of Nino Otero-Warren. However, with the 2020 centenary of women's right to vote, the federal right for women to vote in the United States, Kathleen Cahill, among other scholars, has examined Nino Otero-Warren as a fundamental figure in the advancement of women's right to vote, especially among communities of women of color. Cahill's book is called Recasting the Vote, and there are several chapters on Nino Otero-Warren. Present-day literary critics and historians are re-examining the conversation about the suffrage movement, of course, and Otero-Warren's name emerges as a vital voice in this conversation. That is why she's recognized on the quarter. As you'll see, it says voto para la mujer, right? So this is sort of the signal achievement that for which she's recognized on the US quarter. In New Mexico, Otero-Warren was very successful in parlaying her own political experiences and leveraging her knowledge and connections to effect change. As biographer Whaley puts it, that considerable arm twisting on the part of Nina and others was having a positive effect on the New Mexico legislators in Washington was evident. She had brought to the battle her knowledge of the bureaucracy learned at an early age from her stepfather and uncles. Otero-Warren's ground game was superb, though she was fighting against some very politically dug-in opponents, including Thomas B. Catron, one-time New Mexico senator who rebuffed all discussions of suffrage. The work of Otero-Warren and her suffrage colleagues to see the state pass its own suffrage legislation was not successful, as in 1917, the state legislature voted down suffrage on a state level again, this time by a very narrow margin of 4 votes. And it should be noted that in 1917, the New Mexico state legislature was only 5 years old, as New Mexico had become a state in 1912. Undeterred, Otero-Warren continued to lobby state legislators and congressmen, becoming more confident and effective. Whaley says, Nina had discovered the joy and drama of revolutionary politics and of breaking down stereotypes, and in the process, she had learned to trust her own strength and judgment. With the advent of World War I, suffrage voices nationwide took on a different timbre, as many activists, including Otero-Warren, took on multiple civic roles in addition to their advocacy of suffrage. With Erna Ferguson and Alice Corbin Henderson, Otero-Warren collaborated in war efforts, involving herself with the Red Cross in Santa Fe County, war bonds, and other causes. And this happened throughout the country. Redirect from that pesky question about whether women should vote and focus on these other issues. But the suffragettes were not, the Sufragistas were not to be deterred. Whaley notes that in 1918, state and federal legislators, perhaps in an attempt to sidestep, ignore, or quell suffrage voices, decided to focus on prohibition legislation instead, which would take effect nationally in 1920 and would be repealed 15 years later. Nevertheless, Nina Otero-Warren and others persisted. And eventually, in June 1919, the Congress of the United States of America passed the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, awarding women the right to vote. This amendment required 36 states to ratify it for it to be enacted as law, and Otero-Warren put shoulder to the wheel in New Mexico to see it happen. Although approval of the constitutional amendment passed the New Mexico House, it failed in the Senate, where a substitute referendum for suffrage was proposed. Back to lobbying efforts and fearful that similar efforts would be successful in other states, Otero-Warren and her suffrage colleagues redoubled their efforts, and in February 1920, both houses of the New Mexico legislature voted to ratify the 19th Amendment. New Mexico was the 32nd state to vote in favor of amending the Constitution to guarantee women the federal right to vote, and in 1920, it became so for women throughout the United States. After taking a moment to catch her breath, and awaiting the amendment of the New Mexico State Constitution in 1921 permitting women to hold public office, a concept that seems absurd to even have to be considering in 2022, Otero-Warren put both new legal abilities to the work they were intended and tested out her own considerable pull and acumen. She ran for a congressional seat, becoming, of course, the first Latina to run for Congress in the United States, mere moments after it was possible for women to run for public office in New Mexico. Aside from solidifying support from friends and colleagues she had worked with in promotion of suffrage, her first challenge lay within the Republican Party, which was her party. Otero-Warren stumped from county to county, traveling by automobile and promoting her political goals and candidacy. She announced her candidacy in various newspapers, including La Revista de Taos, as we can see here, where she expressed her goals in excellent Spanish. Otero writes exceedingly articulately in her first language, and the language that was that of the majority of New Mexicans, of course, at this time. Si soy electa, me esmeraré en el representar consistentemente los intereses del pueblo de Nuevo México, con especial atención al proyecto de reclamaciones, las cédulas de tarifa, la extensión de necesarios créditos a rancheros y creadores de ganado, la justa liquidación de deuda que las naciones les deben a aquellos que las defendieron durante la última guerra. The candidacy statement goes on to describe other aspects of her platform, specifically those promoting the education and well-being of children and families, issues dear to her heart. Among these are appealing to the federal government for support for the state in, quote, progresar en materias de educación y materias de salud y en el bienestar de la niñez, and advancing child labor laws, para hacer efectiva la legislación de la labor de los niños. She closes by acknowledging with graciousness the honor that her nomination and election would bring, and her full intention to do well by the people of New Mexico as an elected official of the state. Si soy la escogida de la Convención Republicana para esta oficina, consideraré aquello un alto honor y una oportunidad para el servicio. Of note is that Otero-Warren's Spanish, and there's no indication given that the statement was translated for her, and she did publish many other letters and statements in Spanish in the newspapers. Her Spanish is excellent, in spite of the lack of opportunities for education in Spanish in New Mexican schools during her childhood. Although Otero-Warren's biographer Whaley implies several times that her family and nuevo-mexicana background carried the day in terms of her ability to appeal to Indo-Hispana residents of the state, I would argue that without the ability to speak and otherwise communicate proficiently, not only in language but also culturally, these qualities would otherwise have not been sufficient for her to be as effective as she was. Her language abilities, as well as the cultural knowledge that accompanied them, were fundamental to her success as a civil servant, lobbyist, and candidate. Otero-Warren handily won the Republican primary against incumbent Congressman Nestor Montoya and began her campaign against John Morrow, the Democratic candidate for the congressional seat. Otero-Warren's candidacy and advocacy were unfolding in a political environment that had been in a push-pull since New Mexico became a territory in 1846 and beyond when it was finally granted statehood in 1912. It was enmeshed in what was a very tense social and political milieu. For this reason, a political poem written in support of Otero-Warren by fellow Nuevo Mexicano Felipe M. Maximiliano Chacón is all the more fascinating. Chacón himself was a Democrat, and the Democratic Party indeed won the election with an Anglo candidate, John Morrow, who won by around 10,000 votes, 59,000 to Nina's 49,000. Among the many interesting elements of his poem, Chacón lauds Otero-Warren, the Nuevo Mexicano Republican candidate, completely full voice, as we're going to see shortly. Let's take a quick look at this poem, and so that you can get a sense for the type of lauds that Felipe Chacón shared. And this is a book, El Feliz Ingenio Neomexicano, that I have co-published with retired distinguished professor of American Studies, Gabriel Melendez. It is a transcription and translation of the first book of poetry published by a Mexican American in the US, Obras de Felipe M. Chacón, El Cantor Neomexicano, Poesía y Prosa, which Felipe Chacón published in Albuquerque in 1924. It also includes an introduction, critical contextualization, and full translation of all the poems of Felipe Chacón's book. And of course, among these poems is A la Señora Adelina Otero-Warren, Candidata Republicana para el Congreso 1922. So I'm going to put a little selection of the poem here, but I'd like to read the poem to you so that you can get a sense for what Felipe Chacón was trying to convey. The poem reads, ceñida está tu frente de laureles y tu nombre de honores irradia. Hoy se asoma tu estrella en los dinteles de la aurora triunfal de un nuevo día. El mundo avanza con la idea humana y nacen nuevas cosas en la vida. Hoy refleja la luz de mañana, en otra esfera la mujer nacida. Nacida en el sufragio igual al hombre, pero en lo espiritual más elevada. En pureza moral labra su nombre, y la tierra va bien en su jornada. Aquesta evolución tan meritoria, marcando el alto paso del progreso, cubrirá Nuevo México de gloria, poniendo a una mujer en el Congreso. Habilidosa, competente, honrada, de alma gentil, de corazón sincero. Ella aquí, la del pueblo proclamada, la dama típica, Adelina Otero. Vástago noble de español linaje, y más aún americana pura. Pero ¿qué importa el exterior ropaje del que amerita distinguida altura? No es exclusiva la grandeza humana, que no limita con nación ninguna. De alto cielo su poder dimana, y a quien le place su belleza aduna. Mas no es lisonja que motiva el ser y el interés del egoísmo, que solo encierra mi intención altiva, teñir en la justicia un idealismo. Salud, salud, un brindis de alegría, placer del progresivo ciudadano, os manda junto con la trova mía el saludo de un pueblo soberano. So there are many important sentiments expressed in Felipe Chacón's poem. First of all, the notion, as we see here in this section of the poem, that it would be a great honor for New Mexico to place a woman in Congress, that women are born as equal in men in suffrage, right? That they have the right to vote, to be represented, and in this case, to represent the people of New Mexico. And he, of course, signals the importance of the progressive citizens of New Mexico, saying a toast of joy, right? The happiness of the progressive citizen. We want to see you in Congress, Otero-Warren. So this poem was republished even after her candidacy. As you can see, this is a facsimile that we include in the book of the poem that was published in the Spanish language newspaper La Bandera Americana in 1923. So it wasn't a poem that just sort of disappeared. Though A la Señora Adelina Otero-Warren is by no means the only example of an artistic text supporting Otero-Warren's candidacy, its frankness is echoed in newspaper editorials and in the support she received from many quarters, sometimes outside of New Mexico. Here, in an article in the September 1922 Omaha Bee, an article discusses Otero-Warren's primary victory over Nestor Montoya, naming New Mexico as the latest state to, quote, wheel into line with a woman candidate for Congress. This brief piece praises Otero-Warren for her victory over Montoya, noting that, quote, her compelling victory is notable because of the admitted popularity of the man she defeated. He was elected to Congress 2 years ago by the largest plurality ever given a candidate for the office in New Mexico, and the selection of Mrs. Otero-Warren is therefore the more impressive. The article closes with high hopes for her victory in the congressional election, commenting explicitly not only on her gender, but also on her Spanish bilingualism, which here is seen for the good. Quote, it is not unreasonable to expect that Miss Alice, another woman running for Congress, will not be lonesome in the next Congress, for she will have a colleague not only of her sex, but speaking as well the language of the great Southwest, end quote. In Taos, the Republican-oriented Revista de Taos expressed support for Otero-Warren's candidacy as the Republican candidate for Congress. Not only does the newspaper name her many civic and political positions, it comments explicitly on her involvement in the advancement of suffrage in New Mexico as, quote, presidenta de los clubes de la Federación de Mujeres del Estado durante la campaña a favor del sufragio de la mujer en Nuevo México, gracias a cuyos esfuerzos se debe el triunfo en el estado de esa medida. End quote. The article goes on to say how her proven leadership in the past should leave no doubt as to her future abilities in high office, and specifically talks about how as a female congressman she will demostraría que la energía, la dignidad, la inteligencia o la sabiduría no son solo propias del varón hispano, sino de la mujer, en caps, de esta raza. El triunfo de la señora Otero-Warren es necesario para el más grande orgullo de Nuevo México y de la raza hispana, especialmente al referirnos al sexo mujeril que debe ver en el triunfo de Nina Otero-Warren una de sus mayores glorias. End quote. Clearly, although the Revista de Taos was biased towards Republican candidates, its support of Otero-Warren was also based in gender, and not, as detractors who worked against her suggested, by dragging her short-lived marriage into the conversation, a negative characteristic. After a vigorous campaign, however, Otero-Warren lost the election to the Democratic candidate at a time when the two parties were shifting in terms of their racial composition and predominance in New Mexico. As some political historians of New Mexico have noticed, the 1922 election, to which Otero-Warren's candidacy pertained, was the beginning of a move of many New Mexicans toward the Democratic Party. In any event, Otero-Warren did not lose by a huge margin, in particular, as her biographer Whaley notes, because she was, quote, the first woman to challenge an all-male political system. And that year, the Democrats elected a governor and most of the state officials. Despite the lack of political role models before Nina's campaign, and with no tradition of participation in structured party politics, Hispanic women had quickly become active voters, and most had voted for her, end quote. And indeed, I believe in the same election cycle, Soledad Chavez Chacon was elected Secretary of State of New Mexico. Though the loss must have come as a disappointment to Otero-Warren, Whaley further notes of the 1920 amendment securing women's right to vote, citing cultural critic Vivian Gornick that, quote, women had been released from a collective lifetime of silence, and, quote, those with brains and visionary ideas were not considered eccentric, and many had discovered a sustaining inner clarity and strength, end quote. This certainly seems to be the case with Otero-Warren, who did not rest for long, but nor did she run again for federal office, as she helped her brother Manuel Otero run for governor in 1924. Which she lost by less than 200 votes. In fact, she continued to be who she was in her many different facets, advocating for educational reforms for adults and children in New Mexico, buying a homestead property outside of Santa Fe and operating with her friend Mamie Meters, and continuing to be the heart of her family's home in Santa Fe, which you can still go visit, where her numerous siblings and their children and stepfather lived. Once the Las Dos homestead was established, Otero-Warren began work in the mid-1930s on the book through which I met her, called Old Spain in Our Southwest, which was published by Harcourt Brace Jovanovich in 1936. Otero-Warren had been encouraged by friends in the literary community in Santa Fe and elsewhere to write about her memories of New Mexico daily life and culture from the time of her childhood in Los Lunas and the stories and practices she recalled. Literary scholar Diana Rebolledo grouped Otero-Warren's writing with that of two other Nuevo Mexicana authors of the epoch who also sought to write down and preserve their history, stories, and cultural values as they remembered them. Cuevas Jaramillo in her various books, especially Sombras del Pasado and Romance of a Little Village Girl, and Fabiola Cabeza de Vaca Gilbert's We Fed Them Cactus. All three women were born in the 19th century. Cabeza de Vaca Gilbert was the youngest of the three, and they were all involved in what Rebolledo terms the, quote, cultural flourishing of the northern New Mexico literary scene, end quote. Rebolledo, in her examination of the three authors, brought them back into a literary conversation, and now a folklore conversation, from which they'd been excluded. More recent critique reads these texts with new eyes, great humor, and perspicacity. Old Spain in Our Southwest is a fascinating compilation of several different types of information. The first are historical reflections presented through the lens of Spanish colonial history in New Mexico. This is followed by descriptions of day-to-day life in New Mexico, including celebrations such as saints' days and feasts, and certain concepts that have particular value in New Mexico, such as Otero-Warren's description of water, which is as follows, quote, water actually means the livelihood of the people, not only food, the product of gardens and fields, but all that their surplus may be exchanged for. So water is carefully guarded and saved. There is little wonder that the saints are taken into the field that they may intercede for the farmer, and that God in his mercy may send rain. Water is sacred indeed, end quote. After exploring these fundamental concepts, Otero-Warren focuses on specific historical aspects pertaining to New Mexico, including the explanation of various place names, the history of Nuestra Señora de la Paz, formerly known as La Conquistadora, the patrona of St. Francis Cathedral Basilica, and then also some background on schooling in New Mexico, which we'll return to in just a minute. The book's conclusion recounts songs and stories from New Mexico's past, quoting Chilean Nobel Prize-winning poet Gabriela Mistral, inciting examples from New Mexico's trova of ballad and verse, as well as what are folk stories. And I'd like to add for this section, in her time as superintendent of schools in Santa Fe, she was involved with the Indian school that was in Santa Fe, and had to address many issues regarding bilingual schooling in Santa Fe. She had to negotiate between federal and state administrations and explain to them that Nuevo Mexicano ways, culture, and means of teaching were things that had long histories, that the idea of education was not new in New Mexico. And to this end, I see her often responding in this book to discussions, to conversations in which she had to participate as a civic servant, as an official, and just as an intercultural broker in Santa Fe. And this part is particularly interesting to me, where she talks about schooling. In this section of the book, Early Schooling in New Mexico, she unwrites the propaganda that New Mexicans were uneducated prior to American intervention. Complicating previous readings of Old Spain in our Southwest, this chapter asserts that the earliest schools in New Mexico were native. Quote, "The first schoolhouse in this new world was an Indian estufa. The youth of the tribe or of the clan gathered in this room to be instructed in their traditions, the significance of their dances and social practices," end quote. The chapter elaborates the many different types of teaching and learning that occurred in New Mexico during the colonial period, including the establishment of public schooling by the Mexican government in 1822. Not only providing a contestatory genealogy of education, but also emphasizing the ongoing importance of teaching and instruction, connecting it to the time period in which she wrote. Quote, "Today, if one visits a mountain community, one finds the children in an adobe school building being taught the subjects now requiring report cards, their parents in a setting of their own making, still performing the same tasks uninterrupted for the past 250 years. Otero-Warren's experiences in the political realm clearly translated into how and what she wrote in Old Spain in our Southwest. In the book's glossary, Otero-Warren's personal bilingualism and awareness of her readers' probable unfamiliarity with Spanish terms manifest in the expression and terms she records and explains. She decodes lexical regionalisms in her explanation of the word gallina de la tierra, which is the local word for turkey. Anything that was from the Americas was de la tierra. So gallina de la tierra is a New World chicken or a turkey, and clarifies intersections between Spanish and English, as in the expression ay popé, which she explains means their puppy. She articulates common expressions such as ni con jabón de la Puebla, to say something so dirty that not even a town whose claim to fame was making soap, La Puebla, could clean it. And tan tonto como un burro, which is probably self-explanatory. Otero-Warren also divulges the humor that typifies Nuevo Mexicano life, as in the conclusion of the story The Beggar, or the explanation of the origin of the name for Garrapata Canyon near Taos, New Mexico. And of course, a garrapata is a tick. So you can imagine what that story is about. The lightness distinguishes her, that lightness and humor distinguishes her from her contemporaries, whose memoirs lack the carefully aimed buoyancy that Otero-Warren projects in Old Spain in our Southwest. These may be read as strategies to draw in readers who are unaware or misinformed about New Mexican life, culture, and language. By using humor, Otero-Warren diffuses some of the tension that she was well aware perpetually simmered beneath the surface of interactions between Nuevo Mexicanos and those unfamiliar with New Mexico. Through Old Spain and our Southwest, Otero-Warren undercuts and rewrites the outsider narratives about New Mexico that she had come to know during her years of civic service and political activity in a divided post-territorial New Mexico, and resets the starting points for future policy and public works that affected Nuevo Mexicanos. Otero-Warren went on for many years to successfully, after the publication of Old Spain in our Southwest, to successfully helm her real estate business, to be the matriarch of a family in which she had no children of her own, but who she supported in many ways. And she continued to be a lively voice, not only as a fixture on Santa Fe's increasingly heterogeneous social scene, but who continued to advocate for women's rights, educational advancement, and the well-being of her family. She died in her home just before church, and after, they say, a sip of brandy, on January 3rd, 1965. Nina Otero-Warren was a true New Mexican mujerota, or strong woman. And as such, I wanted to share an image of with you, an image of Nina in her later years, which summarizes, which sort of encapsulates this long line of strong women to whom Nina Otero-Warren pertained. Here you can see Otero-Warren in 1949 at a party she hosted at the McGoffin home in Santa Fe, which was soon after demolished to make a parking lot for the La Fonda Hotel. The costume party was themed as a 19th century gambling salon. And Otero-Warren dressed up as María Gertrudis de Barceló, better known in her day as La Tules, the controversial proprietor of a well-known 19th century casino and brothel in Santa Fe. La Tules was herself a powerful social and political figure of her day, owning her property and directing her business affairs with aplomb. In invoking Latules, Otero-Warren reminded nuevomexicanos of their histories and of the strong women who had always been in their midst. And as with the issue of the new quarter, Nina Otero-Warren continues to be an important figure today in Nuevo Mexicano memory in our cultural practice. I want to share some examples of that here. This is the Nina Otero-Warren official scenic historic marker just outside of Los Lunas in La Constancia, where she was born. So this was part of the project here in New Mexico to have women acknowledged in state historic landmarkers. And she's obviously one of the very important figures in Nuevo Mexicano history. You can go see this landmark. This photo is relatively new. This is a mural that's on here in Albuquerque on 2nd Street and Central, and it acknowledges the many people who advocated for a variety of different types of voting rights here in New Mexico. You can see here on the left, Widow Brenner, it says for supporting free expression, Miguel Trujillo advocating for the native right to vote, and of course, the only woman, Nina Otero-Warren, advocating for women's right to vote for suffrage. So next time you're in Albuquerque and you're near Central, take a look at this amazing mural. And of course, we have most recently, this quarter issued by the United States Mint commemorating Nina Otero-Warren, a huge honor. What an amazing opportunity, what an amazing thing to have Nina Otero-Warren on this quarter. It says Voto para la Mujer, as I mentioned earlier. So primarily looking at the section of her life where she advocated for women's right to vote. We found out from the Mint last week that the flowers at the bottom are yucca blossoms, so blossoms from the state plant of New Mexico. And it's just an amazing, amazing honor to see this really important Nuevo Mexicana recognized in this manner. And finally, I wanted to share with you some opportunities for additional reading. These are articles on various websites talking about Nina Otero-Warren, explaining a little bit more about her background, and offering a little more information than what I was able to provide in this particular presentation. I would like to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you some other time in person. I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit more about the fascinating mujerota, Nina Otero-Warren.
Thank you, Anna, for speaking to us today about Miss Nina Otero-Warren and vividly highlighting her importance in the fight for women's suffrage in New Mexico, and more broadly, in playing an instrumental role in transforming New Mexico politics and education in the early years following the granting of New Mexico statehood. I much appreciate your providing a vivid picture of Miss Otero-Warren's contributions to the state and to highlighting the importance of Nuevo Mexicanos in the political, social, and economic life of New Mexico. For our audience, here once again are the references provided by Dr. Nogar, which offer a more detailed discussion of Miss Otero-Warren's biography and her multifaceted contributions to the state. These citations are also provided on this presentation's lecture link on the Friends of History webpage. And now for next month's presentation. The Friends will offer a joint talk by Robert Knott, a journalist with the Santa Fe New Mexican, and Ms. Gabriela Campos, a photographer for the paper. Last year, Robert and Gabby traveled a significant part of the Santa Fe Trail, reporting on and photographing events and activities surrounding the trail's bicentennial celebration. 1821 was the year that the trail was opened by William Bechdel as the major trading route between Missouri and Santa Fe. Robert will talk about his travels, sharing his observations and interviews made during this trip, many of which were captured in a series of articles published by the New Mexican last fall. Gabby's photos provide a rich visual record of their experiences. Finally, in closing, a reminder that you can rewatch Dr. Nogar's lecture and other presentations in the Friends of History First Wednesday lecture series on our webpage, friendsofhistorynm.org. If you wish to learn more about our upcoming lectures and more broadly about the Friends of History, we urge you to join our mailing list or by emailing us at nmhmfriendsofhistory@gmail.com. Finally, we request you consider making a donation through our webpage so that the Friends of History can continue this lecture series and support other history museum programs. And thanks to all who have been contributing over the last several years. We look forward to seeing you all in the months ahead. Goodbye for now.